All right, good morning. Thank you so much for joining the Catawba County Library this morning. We're delighted to have Jenny Perry with us. She is a very experienced longtime quilter, everything from traditional quilting to art quilts and really interesting, unusual constructions of art quilts and types of quilts. She's going to share with us some information about her journey in quilting and some of her favorite things. And so without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Miss Jenny. Thank you so much for being here this morning.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Jenny Perry, and as you've just been told, I am a longtime quilter. I started quilting in 1975, and it's been a bit of a journey and a lot of changes in what I do regarding quilting. Uh, I didn't really start sewing at all until I was 25. Even though I grew up in a home where my mother was a very accomplished seamstress, she made everything from lingerie to winter coats. And but all five of her daughters eventually learned how to sew, but I was probably the most reluctant. and uh, uh, and I think I was just happy to have her sew, outfits for me, that kind of thing. Why should I do it? My mom seems happy to do it. So I didn't really start sewing until I was about 25, really. And my interest in quilting had been piqued because I saw some quilt exhibits. A very long time ago, there was an exhibit called the Kentucky Quilt Project, and I was living in Kentucky at the time. I've lived in Kentucky most of my life. Um, and the Kentucky Quilt Project elevated the old-fashioned quilts that some of you may have been aware were found in barns and that kind of thing. They kind of went out of favor and were just abandoned and not devalued in a big way. But in fact, there was a lot of expertise in the construction and in the design, and they were worth paying attention to. If you were interested in quilts at all, there was a lot of art to them, actually, even though they were traditional. And so I saw that exhibit in Lexington, Kentucky, and I also happened to see a crazy quilt around that time. And that interested me because I'd never seen a quilt quite like a crazy quilt. And some of you may be aware that a crazy quilt is usually made of silks and satins and contains a lot of embroidery. And they're usually more of the size of a throw as opposed to something that you would put on a bed. And but they are still considered part of the quilt, a quilt in its own right, but they're in the quilt world. People who make quilts are well aware of crazy quilts as well. And these things interested me. So I thought, boy, I'd like to learn how to make those. And we were moving to rural Eastern Kentucky. We rented a house where there was a sewing machine in the basement, an old Singer sewing machine, and it ran perfectly. And so I said, well, I'm going to learn how to make a quilt because I didn't have a full-time job when we made that move. I was just substitute teaching. And I thought, well, here's my chance. I know these women in rural Eastern Kentucky know how to make quilts. I just know they do. Well, I joined a group called the Blacky Sewing Circle. It's in Letcher County, Kentucky. And they probably thought, well, who is this person who wants to learn how to sew? She's less. All the women were at least twice my age, and here was this 25-year-old ready to learn. And I said, what we did was sit around a frame. Some of you can probably envision what I'm talking about, a quilting bee, where we all sat around the frame and we quilted on each other's quilt tops that we had pieced together at home. And so I do have a quilt that was pieced by these women, and I treasure it today. It's well used, well worn. It got thrown in the car every time we went on a trip with our kids, and they would snuggle under it when we'd leave early in the morning or something like that on a big trip. It was well used. When I look at it now, there's a lot lacking as far as design sense and color sense, but nonetheless, it was one of my first quilts. And that's when I started making quilts. And I used that sewing machine to do some piecing. Although initially I felt I needed to do everything by hand because that's the way it was done in the olden days. And it took me a little bit to realize that working with a machine was fine. You can work on a machine to make a quilt. That's fine. And now I do everything by machine. I don't even think my hands can hand quilt anymore. So that's how I got started. This local group that I joined, the Blacky Sewing Circle, we met every week, and we always quilted for about 4 hours, and we had a potluck lunch. Usually it was something like pinto beans and cornbread. And I did that for a year, and I treasure that time. Then in the 80s, I picked up a copy of Quilters Newsletter magazine, which is no longer being published, but it was for a very long time. And I realized when I saw that issue in a sewing shop, a fabric shop, that oh, well, I'm not the only one interested in quilting. I really thought I was alone in this, that I was rediscovering something that had been done in the past, but nobody else was really into it like I was. And I discovered, oh, there's a whole world of people who are rediscovering quilting, what their grandmothers had done. Because really quilting skipped a generation in a way. I had a grandmother who made lovely quilts. My mother never made quilts until much later in her life, when I kind of got her interested in it instead of the other way around, like a lot of people assume. And there was a generation that felt quilts were too common, and the thing to do was to go to Sears and buy a bedspread. You wouldn't make a quilt for your beds. You would go to Sears and buy a lovely bedspread. And around the time of the bicentennial, quilting, took on a real revival because everything was being looked at as the U.S., America historically, and quilting was a big part of its history. So I discovered with Quilters Newsletter, a lot of people were interested in quilts. And so I jumped in with both feet when I realized, oh, there's people in Kentucky, other people in Kentucky who are interested. And I joined the statewide quilt group and became very active in that. And that really became my social life. I lived in rural areas in Kentucky for years and years and years, and often found that I didn't have much in common sometimes with the people where I was living, but because of my interest in quilting and the interest in quilting all around the state of Kentucky, those were my friends. I could talk all day long with them about quilts. And there are a lot of people like that. So it became my world, quilting did. During the 80s and 90s, I began taking quite a few workshops with quilters who had developed their own styles. And a lot of these women were moving away from traditional quilts. And by traditional quilts, I generally mean pieced or appliqued patterns that were usually repeated over and over again, like a log cabin. You may be familiar with that. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of log cabin quilts made. Basically the same design, but maybe the color combination or the layout is a little different, but they're all considered traditional quilts. And there's not that much that is original and unique about them, unless you've occasionally made a real twist in the pattern, what you think of as the traditional pattern. But basically it's what we consider a traditional pattern, a traditional design, a traditional block. And quilts were often considered to be made from blocks, a unit where a bunch of them were put together to make one big bed-sized quilt. But in the 80s and 90s, I started to take some workshops with people who were moving away from that. They had done that, and just as I had been doing that too. But after you've made quite a few of those types of quilts, traditional, you're kind of ready to do something a little special, a little different with the next quilt you make. And so that's kind of how I think art quilting took off. People wanted to do something a little more unique. And a lot of that started with doing something unusual with a traditional pattern. But at some point, it actually moved to doing something with the fabric itself. You didn't have to rely on commercial fabric necessarily. So processes like dyeing fabric and stamping on fabric, painting on fabric, uh, beading, all kinds of techniques entered the quilt world and became, things that quilters wanted to learn to make their own quilts unique. Uh, so in the 90s, I belonged to a group. We called ourselves the Stretch Group because we were ready to stretch, and it sounded like an exercise group, but it wasn't. But we were all ready to move on from the traditional quilting that we had all been doing for quite a while and do our own thing, our own unique thing. And none of us were really copying each other. We wanted to express ourselves more artistically ourselves. And so the Stretch Group was the first group of that type that I belonged to. Then in the around 2000, I belonged to another group called the Kentucky Six Group. And we called our group that because we wanted to limit ourselves to just 6 members, and so that we could meet in each other's homes. And so several times a year we would meet in each other's homes. We lived across the state of Kentucky, and we'd get together and have lunch and do a lot of sharing of what we've been working on. Maybe teachers we had learned something from, demonstrate a technique we had just tried, things that were different from, quite a bit different from, say, that group that I belonged to in Blacky, where we met around the frame and just basically just quilted. And so for quite a few years, I belonged to the Kentucky Six as well. Well, then in 2008, my husband and I retired, and my family is from Canada originally. And so we retired and moved to British Columbia, which is where most of my family still lives. And we were there for about 10 years. And when I moved there, I thought, well, I've got to find some fiber artists there, some quilters. And by this time, I was kind of thinking of them in terms of being fiber artists, more than just quilters, traditional quilters. And so there was a big group. Western Canada has a group called the Fiber Art Network, and each year that group would put together a cohesive exhibit that would travel, usually to different galleries, or it would sometimes appear at a quilt show. You would have a chance to see it at a quilt show. It traveled around for 2 or 3 years sometimes. And generally, these exhibits had a theme or some guidelines that put them all together into a group. There was a reason they were being shown as a group. They had a color in common, or a theme in common, or a size. They usually had guidelines regarding size, so that when they hung on the wall, they would all make a nice presentation because they would all be the same size, for example. The people putting these shows together were thinking more like galleries might when they bring in a bunch of paintings to show. They wanted something that presented itself well as a group of art, with paintings or artwork. So I was involved with that for 10 years and took part in quite a few of the exhibits that the Fiber Art Network presented. Now here in Asheville, we decided after 10 years in British Columbia, I don't know if you've ever been to British Columbia, but there's a lot of snow there. So after 10 years there, that was interesting and fun, and we enjoyed it, but we could also see that it probably isn't a great place to grow old when you have to deal with shoveling snow. And we lived out of town, about 30 minutes away from a town. So while it was lovely on a lake, and you could ice skate on the lake in the winter and all that sort of thing, at a certain point, I gave up ice skating. I gave up, I did that when I first moved there, but we could see that might be better to choose another location that's milder. And so we had been to Asheville many times, and when I was living in Kentucky, and we decided, well, let's choose Asheville. So we bought a place here a few years ago, and we were here part-time for a number of years, and then we finally said, okay, we've got to make a choice, and we'll move down to Asheville. So that's why I'm here, and I'm part of a group called the Mountain Art Quilters, and it's an art quilt group here in Asheville, and it kind of formed as an offshoot before I ever moved here, an offshoot of the Asheville Quilt Guild, where a couple of members who were interested in getting away from what's traditionally thought of as traditional patterns and bed quilts and that sort of thing into more artistic work. So it's a small offshoot of the Asheville Quilt Guild. That's how it began. And we have about 25 members. We're limited because we do have a meeting space that doesn't hold much more than that. So we would I'm sure there might be a lot more people interested in art quilting in our area, but we have to limit the numbers of our members just because of the meeting space. So here in Asheville, I've continued to make quilts and show quilts, and I belong to a couple of organizations that put out what we call calls for entry, where they'll present some guidelines for making a quilt, and you submit an entry hoping to get in. A lot of times they're juried, just like an art show of paintings might be. You might submit your painting, or in my case, an art quilt, and hope that the jurors actually at this point, choose it to be part of a cohesive group of quilts for a quilt show. So that's the kind of thing I do now, and I've been lucky to get into quite a few shows. So today I do have several exhibits to show you that to give you an idea of what I'm talking about when I say art quilts. Before I begin, in general, they are smaller than a bed quilt. It would be unusual to see an art quilt that is really large, although it's possible, and some people do make them large. But for the most part, quilts that are considered art quilts are more wall size. They're designed to hang on the wall. And most people don't want something that's 80 by 100 hanging on the wall. It takes up a large wall. So in general, they're smaller. I guess I'll show you first my own artwork, and then we'll move to some other exhibits that either I've been part of or I have friends who have been part of it, just to show you examples of what can be done with art quilting. Okay, let me share my screen here. Okay. I want this one first. Okay. Now, move you guys over a little bit on the side. All right, first slide is here. Let me play. And it should go to full screen, I hope. And it's not doing it. I wonder why. Well. Okay, here we go. All right. That's not what the first slide is supposed to look like, but it's supposed to say my artwork on it, but it doesn't. Okay, well, let's try go to the next one, because that'll actually get to the artwork, I hope. Here we go. Okay, these are what is in this little grouping of this presentation are recent quilts that I've made just in the last 2 or 3 years. This is a quilt called Koi Pond, and the reason I made this quilt was because the piece of fabric that you see in the center I dyed it, and by a process called ice dyeing. And there are many ways to dye fabric, but ice dyeing is a unique way to do it, where you allow ice to melt over the fabric and there's been dye sprinkled on the ice. So as it melts, it hits the fabric at different times and in different ways. And it's totally serendipity, although there are some processes that ensure a more precise result. But in this case, this is what I ended up with. This is a piece of silk in the center, and for some reason it just reminded me of koi ponds. And I've been to botanical gardens in a number of cities, and there's often a koi pond there where the fish are swimming around. And so I just added the fish to my koi pond and put rocks around the outside. Now the koi pond fabric is dyed. Some of the fish, in fact, I think all of the fish are also dyed by me, and even the rocks. That's a dyed silk fabric. The entire quilt is silk, in fact. Another thing about art quilting is that often you're working with non-traditional fabrics. When you think of a quilt, you often think of cotton fabrics and on your bed. And in art quilting, cotton fabrics are fine, but you'll often find other fabrics as well. And I have come to love silk. I love anything with silk. So in this case, the entire quilt is silk. The rocks are silk, the background, and so on. Okay. This piece is called Bird of Paradise. And this was based on a photograph that I took when I was in Mexico a few years ago. Again, I've got some ice dyed fabric as my background. Two different pieces of ice dyed fabric kind of create that background behind the flower itself. And then the flower itself is created from silk. Some people wonder where I get my silk, and the best answer is Goodwill or any thrift store. A lot of times when if you enjoy working with silk, a lot of times when you go to Goodwill, you can find blouses or dresses. They may not fit you at all, but the fabric is fabulous. So, or a wonderful color. So I buy them. They're, for $4 or $5, you've got a pretty good amount of fabric in a blouse or a dress, and I just cut them up. And the selection of fabric, silk fabric in a Goodwill store is a lot greater than in any fabric store. It's often patterned. It's often colors you'd never see in a fabric store. And for the most part, good luck finding any silk of any kind in a fabric store. Most fabric stores don't sell it. You would have to order it online, and it's usually very pricey by the yard. So that's my source for a lot of my fabric that you see in my pieces. Now this piece here it's called Stilt Walker 1, because it's the first one I made like this. Behind me on my screen, when you see me full screen, it's hanging behind me. This piece was made by for a show where the size requirement was 12 inches by 48 inches, which is a rather odd size. I think you'd all agree for any artwork. But the first thing I thought of was some photographs I had taken on a trip to Montreal, and we went to a little festival that was kind of a surprise to us. We encountered it in the old port in Montreal, and there were people walking around in colorful silk costumes, and there were balloons hanging everywhere, and there were little white circus-looking tents everywhere, and it was quite a magical scene. And so I had taken a lot of photographs there. So the piece I ended up making is kind of took elements from a number of photographs and put them into one. It's not an exact duplicate of any one photograph. And the reason I chose the design, of course, something like a stilt walker automatically is a lot longer than the average person. So that adds a lot of length to his image. And so that's why I chose this design. And you'll see in a minute, I sometimes use the same design again. So in fact, here it is again. This is a smaller version of that same idea. I just scaled it down and made a smaller version, a very similar looking quilt. This one though is only 5 by 15, and that's because I attended a conference where we did an art exchange, and the size requirement for that one was make a piece that's 5 inches by 15 inches. That's pretty small, but it's nice to, just hang in your bathroom or in a hallway or something like that. And so again, because it's long and skinny, I thought I'm going to make another stilt walker. This size actually accommodated the stilt walker a little better than the much longer one. It didn't look quite as weird to have such a long piece. But anyway, this was my second one using the same image. And I've done that several times, recreated a quilt by using the same imagery, not necessarily the exact same design or anything like that, but similar imagery. Okay, this is a piece that was made for a challenge that my Mountain Art Quilters has been putting together, and I'll show you the entire exhibit that we put together shortly. We wanted to do triptychs. Now, in the art world, there are such things as diptychs and triptychs, and diptychs are usually 2 panels that go together as one artwork. A triptych, as the name implies, are 3 panels that go together as one artwork, and they don't necessarily have to create one single picture, although this one does, but they need to be they're unified in some way. So this is one of my triptychs that I made for the exhibit that we put together, and it's from a photograph that I took in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende. And if you've ever been to Mexico, or even a Mexican restaurant often has these, they're paper cuts. And so they were strung across the street in this town. And I just thought they made a very nice photograph. So I photographed them, and basically what you see here is very similar to the photograph I made. I didn't make too many changes to the image itself. And all of those little paper cuts are just done on my sewing machine, stitched on my sewing machine with a free motion foot. Now, free motion is a way to sew where you are much more in control than just sewing a seam, where the sewing machine will kind of take the what you're sewing through and stitch it and feed evenly across to make a seam. With free motion, you're moving the fabric and you're also pushing the foot pedal to control the speed at which you're sewing. And so it's a process that takes some practice. It's a little like patting your head and rubbing your tummy at the same time. It feels weird at first, but with some practice you can do it. So this entire piece is free motion quilted, actually. I control the machine as I move the piece around, and this way with free motion, you can go in any direction. You're not limited to just sewing straight ahead as you would doing a seam. So even the flags are free motion. You might say it's free motion embroidered, since I used contrasting thread and created the design just by the stitching I was doing free motion. Okay, this one is Ladder to the Stars, and I've used this one a couple of times in different pieces where there was a call for something to be made. This is what I've made. And again, I took a photograph of a ladder actually, I believe this one might have been in Santa Fe, not Mexico, Santa Fe, New Mexico. And in this case, I printed the photograph onto fabric using an inkjet printer. And this is a common process that art quilters use too. They print their own fabric. And in my case, I just have your standard desktop Epson printer. It's nothing fancy. But there are printers made that will print a much larger piece of fabric or a much larger image on fabric. So I'm somewhat limited because I only have the free one that came when I bought a computer one time. But I printed the ladder, and I cut the ladder out of what I printed and did what's called fusing it to the background piece. And the background is just painted. I just used a toothbrush and flicked some paint to create the stars, the Milky Way look. And there's a little fabric added at the bottom to create the grasses that the ladder is cut, where the ladder is placed. So art quilts often involve paint and something called Shiva paint sticks. I used a little Shiva paint stick along the bottom where it's just almost like a pastel, and you rub some color to alter the color of a fabric. So there are a lot of processes, and I find that most art quilters are willing to try anything, where they hear about a process. Oh, I think I'll try that, And so the number of techniques and processes that you can use in making an art quilt is kind of endless in a way. Okay, this is another photograph that I took in Mexico. This was in Oaxaca. And I used it as my image and for this piece, which is entirely made out of fabric. Now, what you're looking at here is a man I saw on the street, and he was doing what's called thread painting. He was using thread, and you can see a bunch of thread is at his feet there below the easel. And he was stitching the scene that he could see from his line of vision down the street. And I was just amazed that somebody was doing this in public. You've seen artists painting in public, probably, if you've traveled. And so this man was just there and, doing this stitching on a piece of fabric that was stretched onto stretcher strips on an easel. And what you see on what he's working on there was basically what was in his line of vision. And so I was fascinated, and of course knew that anybody who does what I do would be interested in knowing about this man. So I took quite a few photographs of him, and I have since made several photographs based on him doing his thread work in public. It's like, an artist painting en plein air. That one is just a little quilt, just probably about 12 by 12. Okay, another photograph I took. This is I call this Stairwell Rehearsal because I was in Mexico again. If you can't tell, I love going to Mexico. And I happened to come around the corner in a building. It was the Bellas Artes building in San Miguel, and it's where a lot of art and cultural events happen. And I rounded the corner, and here was this man in the stairwell playing the violin beautifully. And I think he probably was practicing for a class he was taking or for a performance he was going to be giving later. And the acoustics in the stairwell must have been really good, and it did sound good. So I snapped a quick photo. I don't think he even was aware of it. And so I've made that into a quilt as well. And that may be it for that presentation. Yes, it is. Okay. So let me get rid of that one. Let me check what I've got in my lineup here. Okay, I want to show you this one. This exhibit here is the Triptych exhibit I mentioned, and let me pull that one down. Okay, this exhibit is one we recently put together last fall, and I did create a little website for it, and at some point I'll show you the link to that, where you can look at it again later if you'd like to. So we called the exhibit Threefold, the Art of the Triptych. And what we did was, as an art quilt group, we thought, well, let's put together an exhibit that we can present to galleries or other venues with the idea that they'll be shown there. And we'll have it completely put together. It's not something, a proposal we're going to make, and then we make the artwork. We're going to make the artwork first. So that's what a lot of us were working on last fall. And actually we got started pre-COVID, and kind of it lapsed a little bit, our plan, but last fall we completed it. So we invited some friends from Virginia who are also art quilters to join us because we were afraid we wouldn't have enough pieces in the whole exhibit. So you can see that there's some tradition as far as piecing with some of the artists. Not all of them do what I do. I like to work from photographs a lot. So I love taking photographs and I love working from photographs. if the image, appeals to me. So here's one that is pieced completely, and but showing different seasonal transitions. This is one where she has divided the image of the horse into 3 different sections, but it's basically the same a single image that has been divided. This is one I like this one a lot because the glassware that she has shown there, it's completely made with fabric and maybe a little bit of paint, but it has a realistic look to it, the way she has created it. This one is Slow Down and See, and she's basically just taken a tree image and the mountain. I think the mountains and the imagery found in the mountains appears a lot in places where the artists live in the mountains. So this is the case here. More piecing. This woman here, Diana Ramsey, this is her style, and a lot of times artists do develop a style, and if I were to see another one of her artwork somewhere, I would say, oh, that looks like a Diana Ramsey piece. At some point, just like painters, you can look at an artwork and go, oh, I think that looks a lot like it was made by so-and-so. Some people jump around in their experimentation, but often they land on a style, and this is Diana's style. She's a member of the Southern Highland Craft Guild, and in fact, several of the people that you're going to see in this particular exhibit are. And if you ever go to the Folk Art Center in Asheville on the Blue Ridge Parkway, you're likely to see work by these women. They have, if you've ever been to the Folk Art Center, you're aware that they usually have quilts going up the stairway to the 2nd level, and she often has a piece there. Okay, Endless Cycle. This is one of the Virginia artists who is a guest artist. And again, here's my piece. I have 2 triptychs in this exhibit. I think I was so nervous that people wouldn't take part that I decided I better make 2. But this is one of them. And I talked about that a little earlier. Now this is my 2nd triptych. It's called Going to Town, and it's actually based on a painting I did. I took one thing about art quilting is I find that it's helpful to take classes in things other than art quilting or other than quilting at all. And so I took an acrylic painting class, and so this was essentially the image that I did in an acrylic painting class where these people were heading to town, a big city, and I liked it. And I took it at John C. Campbell Folk School. I liked it a lot, but it did sell at the show and tell. We had, if you've ever been to John C. Campbell Folk School in Brasstown, North Carolina, there's a show and tell at the end of the week where the people who've taken a class all week get to show off to all the other people there what they've been working on. And at the show and tell, somebody wanted to he actually wanted to trade, but it's technically a sale, I think. So he was a wood turner who made a beautiful wooden kaleidoscopes, and so he traded a kaleidoscope for my painting. So that was the last I saw of that painting, but I do like the imagery from it, so I've created it here in a quilt. And this one is a photograph was used to make this particular piece as well. This is a woman who lives here in Asheville and has the woods behind her window, or from her window. As you can see, most people in this triptych took an image and just divided it into 3. And there's some irises. Some art quilters work completely abstract, and that's the case of this woman here. She's showing creative energy, but as you can see, it's abstract. You don't see images you recognize that much in it. Another thing you'll often see on art quilts is something that sticks out from the quilt, which you would never see on a bed quilt. And so she's made some fabric ginkgo leaves here, and they stand out from the piece itself on this quilt. Another triptych by the same woman. You can see that in her triptych, she has connected all three by little bands of fabric, but there is still the division of three. This is one that was painted on on fabric, and I expect I'm not certain, but I expect the images of the people themselves were painted separately and applied to background pieces of fabric. Now here's an example of a triptych where there are tree images in all three, but they don't unite to form one image. It's not like one photograph divided. She's just chosen three different tree images to put together, and it's the theme of trees that ties it together. This is River by Sarah Nutter, and sometimes the title tells you what to look for. And so in this case, I think she has, by just calling it River, you immediately see that there's a river flowing through all three pieces. And this is botanical number 5, and it's called that because the leaves that you see in the fabric used here are, it's a dyeing process that a lot of quilters have been using in more recent years called eco printing is what it's called. And real leaves from real trees are used to imprint onto fabric. And sometimes the imagery is very sharp. You can see all the veins, that sort of thing. And most of the time, the colors the resulting colors are subtle. And you can see these aren't vibrant, but the imagery is there, and it's very, very soothing and pretty to see botanical printing. So she's used botanical prints in all three of those panels. Here's another man. This is a male quilter, which in this day and age isn't as unusual as it once was, but because you traditionally think of quilting as a thing that women do. But there are, oh, did it go to the next one there? Okay, I know why it did that. Okay, I didn't change all of the settings on this ahead of time. Okay, we're going fast now. I meant to change the transitions on all of these, but it's now on automatic, I can see. But these are additional pieces in the exhibit, and that's it. Okay. I'm sorry to have sped up those last ones, but they have a mind of their own sometimes when you do a presentation. Okay, let me see what else I've got in my window here, and I'll pull up. Okay, this one. This particular exhibit is by a group in British Columbia. Now, since COVID, like all of you, I've been on Zoom a lot, and I was a member of a group in Western Canada. Generally, I only saw most of these women once a year at a conference, but we all knew each other. And when Zoom meetings started, a small group in the Vancouver area, they decided to meet every Friday on Zoom, and everybody would be in their own studios working, their own sewing rooms. Studio is just a fancy word for sewing room. And we would be working on each other's projects, or our own projects, but in the company of others. It was a way to stay connected with others in the way that I understand that a quilting group comes to the library and quilts periodically. And so, quilting any art can be kind of solitary. and it's good to get together and do it with other people. So I started doing that when COVID began with this group in Vancouver. And I can tell you that because of Zoom, I know these women way better than I ever would have just seeing them in person once a year. So they put on an exhibit. I did not take part in this particular exhibit, but they put on an exhibit which was shown at one of their libraries. I'm not sure if your libraries, ever show artwork, have an art exhibit, but I hope you'd be open to that idea. And these pieces were all fairly small. They might have been like 12 by 12 or 12 by 16, something along that line. There was a small size limitation. When they're small like that, it's easier to hang quite a few of them. So, and easy to transport them. If you're just, taking them in a car, nothing has to be rolled up, that kind of thing. So this particular exhibit was called A Touch of Orange. And the reason that it's called that, do I have the beginning one? I'm going to start it at the beginning. The reason it was called that is, now let me go back. Okay. Okay, the reason it is called that is, let me get to this, okay. Can all of you hear me okay right now? Okay, just wanted to check because this had some sound to it that I didn't want to play. And I didn't know if since I muted that, if I was also muting the Zoom. Okay. What happened with this group is somebody had a bunch of scarves and they all had some orange in them and they wanted to get rid of them. They didn't want them. They had way too many scarves. And here I am wearing an orange scarf. But so they gave them out to the other members and they decided, well, let's do a challenge based on these scarves and we'll call it A Touch of Orange. So they all decided to put together a little exhibit. I mean, that's how quickly an idea for an exhibit can come together. So there is a little bit of orange in every one of the quilts that you'll see. And I think the scarves themselves were what people were asked to use in their pieces. And you can see this woman has used photographs and dyed fabric and over-dyed fabric, that kind of thing, to create kind of an abstract, but you still see real imagery in it. Here's one who works, Terry Ask works very graphically when she does her work. And so you often see a very stark, what's called modern quilting. There is a category of quilting known as, that has emerged in the last, 10, 15 years called modern quilting. And often it's colors similar to what you see here and very simple imagery, nothing too complicated, but it's effective because of its simplicity. Here's one with an octopus. I'll just run through these. So again, it's a little more modern. This woman, Robin Fisher, pretty much hand dyes and paints everything she uses in her artwork. So probably every bit of that fabric you see in this piece started out as white fabric, and she has colored it or altered it in some way to make it her own. This woman, Vicki Gray, does a lot of embroidery. And so this takes on a bit of a traditional look, but it's a little different from your usual embroidery that you see. And here beads have been used to create the idea of dewdrops on flour. This is, I'm not sure what technique she has used, but just the fact that this is 12 inches by 12 inches tells you there's a lot of intricate work in this, just that it's that small and she's working that small. It looks to me like it is painted and then stitched. These are probably all painted fabrics cut out as the flowers, and the touch of orange appears in the bees. Another pieced abstract. Another pieced abstract. I like this one because it's an image. I like imagery in fabric more than abstract, so that's my preference though. And often on art quilts, you'll see embellishment added, charms or beads or little dangly things coming off the surface, that sort of thing. This one, I hope you can kind of see what it represents. It's supposed to be just a horizon line with a very a very late in the sunset, so that you have a little bit of a hint of a reflection in water below it. It doesn't show up that well on my screen, so I don't know how it's looking on yours. But anyway, I like this when I saw it, just a single image of it, a lot. But it looks a little dark in what I'm looking at right now. This particular woman, Carly McChesney, for some reason has a I only say that because I don't have a fascination with math, but she has a fascination with math. And often she incorporates origami and math equations and that sort of thing into her artwork. And this woman does a lot of painting of fabric. Hard to say what the techniques are in this one. I am not sure. And this also looks like some of the botanical printing that I mentioned in that last presentation. And little looks like orange fabric just to create a little scene with flowers and leaves. This woman has incorporated some words into hers, a little saying about wisdom and knowledge. And this last slide is just the final slide in this presentation where it shows where it's the exhibit is showing. Now, I think I have one more I'm going to show you if we have time. Let me get rid of that one. And that one. No. Okay. No. Okay. No, that may be it. Okay.
Jenny, just to let you know,
Well,
I've got eight
I
minutes
do have a
left
few
in the
photos I was going to also show you, individual photos. This is a photo of my stilt walker. This is the photograph I worked from. And if you can see behind me at all and see the image of the man, you can see that that is the image I took. But some of the lower parts, the tents and that sort of thing, were taken from other photographs to create him. Let me see. Let me pull everything up in this preview. Okay, I've done that one. And there he is. Okay. Now, you can see that one thing I did was flip them around. And so I do sometimes use my computer to play with photos and change them a little bit, alter them a little bit, make them bigger, smaller, and in this case, change the direction he's walking in. So a computer has become an art tool as well. Let me see if I can, okay. I think that is all I had in mind to show you today. And I'm gonna put these two links on the screen. JennyPerry.net is my own website where I have some of my artwork, and Mountain Art Quilters.wordpress.com is the website for the Mountain Art Quilters group, and it highlights the Triptych exhibit that I just showed you. And so I hope, you know, at some point you might want to visit both of those websites. The one with the Triptych Exhibit, the Mountain Art Quilters link, we are looking for venues to show our exhibit in person. So if you're aware of a location where our exhibit could be shown in person, we'd love to hear from you. That was part of the plan of putting the exhibit together, is to find a home for it. Not a permanent home, of course, but, you know, a temporary exhibit. So hope you'll take that into consideration. And if you have any questions, I would love to hear about them. So let me see if
Jenny, can you hear me?
get back to my Zoom here.
Jenny, can you hear me?
Lost my Zoom here, or at least the part that says, oh, there it is. Okay. I was looking for it at the bottom to stop sharing. Okay. Do some of you have questions?
Can you hear me, Jenny? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, before we take questions, I am going to stop recording in just a moment. And before I do, I just want to mention that the library is having a couple of other quilting related programs that are coming up on the 19th at the Hickory Museum of Art. Our Black History discussion group is going to talk about quilting in American history and all of the different ways actually that quilts actually played a prominent role in events that happened, you know, significant events, both nationally and individually for people. And then on the next day, on the 20th, we have Danielle Lasker from the Penland School coming to the Hickory Museum of Art. She is the textile studio coordinator at the Penland School. Her first love was quilting, and so she is going to talk a little bit about the different constructions of going from traditional quilts into modern day quilts. On the 19th, the Black History quilting discussion is going to be at 4 p.m. at the museum. And on the 20th, Danielle's presentation at the museum is going to be at 1 p.m. And so we hope that if people are able to come for either or both of those, that they'll walk around the museum and see the quilts on exhibit there right now before we engage in our program. And with that, I am going to stop the recording